The obsidian-tipped arrows whistled through salt air as Nahua warriors on the shoreline watched impossible mountains drift across the horizon, their white wings catching wind that carried no scent of earth or stone. In the spring of 1519, as the one-reed year unfolded according to the sacred calendar, the world split open. What approached the coast of San Juan de Ulua defied every law written in star charts and temple codices. These weren't islands, islands didn't move against the current. The pale-skinned beings aboard these floating mountain houses commanded cloth wings that billowed without human breath, vessels that glided forward without a single paddle cutting water. From the western basin of Lake Texcoco, Moctezuma II ruled an empire that stretched across the mountainous heart of Mexico. 250,000 souls called Tenochtitlan home, while several million more across the Triple Alliance Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan sent tribute that filled the imperial storehouses with cotton mantles, cacao beans, and featherwork by the thousands. The great Tlatoani had weathered 27 years of rule, conquering cities and collecting hearts for the gods. But no amount of blood spilled on pyramid steps had prepared his seers for this. The messengers arrived breathless, their cotton cloaks still damp with sweat from the coast road. They spoke of beasts that ate grass and ran like the wind, four-legged creatures that carried men on their backs as if they were living thrones. The strangers themselves appeared wrapped in metal that caught sunlight like polished obsidian, but harder than any stone the Empire's craftsmen had ever shaped. When these pale visitors raised hollow staffs to their shoulders, iron thunder cracked across the beaches. The sound split ears, left witnesses deaf for hours, and belched smoke that reeked of sulfur from the deepest caves. Hernando Cortés had landed with roughly 500 soldiers and 100 sailors, but to Nahua eyes, each man seemed to possess the strength of 20 warriors. 16 horses stamped and snorted on unfamiliar ground, their nostrils flaring at scents of copal incense and unfamiliar flowers. The handful of cannon that Spanish crews wrestled from ship to shore would soon reshape the balance of two worlds. But for now they sat silent as sleeping giants, bronze mouths pointed toward a civilization that had never heard gunpowder speak. Within weeks, the political landscape began to fracture along lines of old resentment. At Chempuala, the Totonac people welcomed these strange visitors with desperate enthusiasm. For decades, Mexica tribute collectors had descended upon their coastal settlements like locusts, demanding impossible quantities of cotton mantles, precious cacao beans, and intricate featherwork that required months to complete. Every tribute season brought the same humiliation: bent backs, empty granaries, and the knowledge that Tenochtitlan grew fat on their labor. But the strangers offered something the Totonacs had never dared imagine: alliance with beings who seemed to command thunder itself. The key to everything that followed walked among the Spanish camp wearing the cotton dress of a Maya slave girl, but speaking words that could unlock empires. Malintzin, whom the Spanish called Doña Marina, possessed a gift more precious than all the gold in Moctezuma's treasury. She could make the words plain. Her voice bridged the chasm between Nahuatl and Maya, while Jeronimo de Aguilar carried Spanish thoughts into Maya sounds. Through this chain of translation, Cortés learned of tribute lists, military formations, and the deep wells of hatred that his enemies had spent generations digging. The reports that reached Moctezuma grew more disturbing with each runner. These pale men had fired their iron thunder at Chempuala, demonstrating power that shattered stone walls and sent warriors fleeing with hands pressed to bleeding ears. Witnesses described smoke that smelled like the breath of underworld demons, and sounds that seemed to tear holes in the sky itself. Some messengers swore they had watched Spanish soldiers drink warm blood from their mounts when provisions ran short, an image so alien that scribes struggled to capture it in pictographs. As summer deepened toward autumn, the impossible became inevitable. The floating mountains had disgorged their contents, and now a force unlike anything in the chronicles was marching inland toward the heart of the empire. They moved with purpose, gathering allies like a river, collecting tributaries, turning the tribute system's own weight against itself. Picture yourself standing on the palace steps of Tenochtitlan as the first reports arrive, watching Moctezuma's face drain of color as he realizes the one-reed year might herald not renewal but ending. The September rains had begun by the time Cortés reached Tlaxcalan territory, where his small army would face its first true test against thousands of warriors, whose Macuahutl blades could split Spanish steel if they could get close enough to swing them. The Macuahutl blade whistled through morning air, its razor-sharp obsidian teeth catching sunlight as it swept toward the Spanish rider's neck, close enough that horsehair scattered like black snow in the wind. September 1519 had brought the dry season to the Tlaxcalan highlands, but the earth would soon drink deep. Here, among the pine-scented mountains east of the Great Lake, two ways of war were about to collide with the force of grinding millstones. The Tlaxcalans had spent generations sharpening their hatred against Mexica tribute collectors, their warriors hardened by constant border skirmishes that had turned every valley into a potential battlefield. Now, these bitter enemies of Moctezuma faced strangers who claimed to be their allies, but first, Tlaxcalan honor demanded they test Spanish steel against obsidian glass. Thousands of warriors poured down the mountainsides like a human avalanche. Their cotton, Ichkahuipili armor, thick as a man's thumb and waxed to deflect arrows, gleamed white against sun-darkened skin. Eagle, down feathers fluttered from their atlatl darts, each projectile carved from hardwood and tipped with volcanic glass that could punch through Spanish mail at close range. The air thrummed with war cries in Nahuatl, voices calling upon Tezcatlipoca and Huitzilopochtli to witness the slaughter about to unfold. But this wouldn't be like the ritual flower wars that had dominated Mesoamerican conflict for centuries. The Spanish had no interest in capturing prisoners for sacrifice they fought to kill, and their weapons had been forged in a different kind of hell. The first charge broke like ocean waves against granite cliffs. Tlaxcalan warriors, accustomed to enemies who fought with similar weapons and tactics, found themselves facing horses that struck with iron-shod hooves and carried riders armored in steel that turned their finest obsidian blades. The Macuahuitl, that devastating wooden sword embedded with volcanic glass teeth, could indeed sever a horse's head with a two-handed swing, but only if the warrior survived long enough to land the blow. Spanish arquebuses cracked through the mountain air, each shot punching through cotton armor and dropping warriors who had never imagined death could strike from such distances. The sulphur smoke that followed each volley burned throats and stung eyes, while the thunder of cannon fire echoed off stone peaks like the voice of an angry god. Horses shrieked as obsidian points found gaps in their protection, their nostrils flaring at the alien scent of gunpowder and the familiar copper tang of blood. Yet the Tlaxcalans possessed something the Spanish had rarely encountered in Europe: absolute fearlessness in the face of the unknown. These were men who had grown up expecting to die in battle, who considered capture and sacrifice on enemy pyramids a path to honor in the afterlife. They adapted with terrifying speed, learning to target the joints where Spanish armor was weakest: wrists, knees, the gaps between helmet and gorget. Hooked poles appeared in their ranks, designed to drag mounted riders from their saddles and pin them for the killing stroke. Through the dust and chaos, individual acts of heroism blazed like stars. Tlaxcalan nobles, in jaguar suits, roared their lineage names as they charged Spanish positions, their voices carrying promises of vengeance for decades of Mexica oppression. Elite warriors wearing eagle down and quetzal feathers danced between Spanish swords, their movements flowing like water around stone, seeking the perfect moment to strike with Macuahuitl or thrust with obsidian-tipped spears. But even courage had limits. The Spanish fighting style proved as alien as their weapons: no ritual, no ceremony, just brutal efficiency aimed at ending life as quickly as possible. Horses trampled fallen warriors who expected quarter, while Spanish swords hacked through cotton armor with relentless precision. The Tlaxcalans had prepared for flower war. They faced total war instead. Days of skirmishing blurred into a grinding nightmare of ambush and counter-ambush. Tlaxcalan commanders, watching their finest warriors fall to weapons they barely understood, began to reassess their position. These pale strangers had proven their power in blood, but more importantly, they had proven their hatred for the Mexica Empire ran as deep as Tlaxcalan resentment. In council meetings held by torchlight, as healers worked to save warriors whose wounds defied traditional medicine, Tlaxcalan nobles debated a possibility that would have seemed impossible mere days before. If these strangers truly sought to destroy Moctezuma's empire, if they could provide the military edge needed to overthrow generations of tribute and humiliation, then perhaps the old enemies could become new allies. The smell of copal incense mixed with the metallic taste of blood as Tlaxcalan priests cast bones and consulted the sacred calendar. The signs remained unclear, but the practical situation had crystallized with brutal clarity. The Spanish had demonstrated power that could shatter the existing order, and the Tlaxcalans had suffered enough under Mexica domination to risk everything for the chance of freedom. Consider the impossible choice facing Tlaxcalan commanders as they watched Spanish surgeons tend wounds with techniques that seemed like sorcery, knowing each healed enemy would return to fight again. The decision that emerged from those smoke-filled council sessions would reshape the balance of power across all Mexico, turning a Spanish expedition of hundreds into an indigenous coalition of thousands, all aimed at the heart of Tenochtitlan. The morning drums of Cholula fell silent mid-beat as Spanish steel found the drummer's throat, his blood spattering across the carved stone face of Quetzalcoatl in the temple courtyard below. October 1519 had brought the dry season to the sacred city of Cholula, where the Great Pyramid rose higher than any structure in the known world, its steps worn smooth by countless pilgrims seeking the feathered serpent's blessing. The city's markets bustled with traders from across Mesoamerica, their stalls heavy with obsidian blades from distant quarries, cotton textiles dyed in cochineal red, and cacao beans that served as currency from the tropical lowlands to the highland valleys. The air shimmered with copal incense and the smoke of cooking fires, while the sound of grinding maize on stone metates provided the rhythm of daily life. None of the 20,000 souls who called Cholula home suspected they were living through their final ordinary morning. Cortés had arrived with his growing army of Spanish soldiers and Tlaxcalan allies, the latter still adjusting to the strange reality of marching alongside the pale strangers they had tried to kill mere weeks before. The Tlaxcalans carried their new alliance like a sacred burden, knowing that generations of their ancestors would either curse or bless their decision depending on what came next. Their cotton armor bore the stains of recent battles, while fresh obsidian points glinted from atlatl darts they hoped never to use against Spanish steel again. The Cholulans welcomed their visitors with the elaborate courtesy due to powerful strangers. Noble houses opened their courtyards, offering tortillas warm from clay griddles, chocolate frothed with vanilla and chili, and the complex rituals of hospitality that had governed Mesoamerican diplomacy for centuries. Priests burned precious copal before jade-eyed idols, seeking divine guidance for properly honoring guests whose true intentions remained as mysterious as their origins. But beneath the surface courtesy, darker currents swirled. Malintzin, whose gift for languages had made her indispensable to Spanish strategy, caught fragments of whispered conversations in the markets. Her ears, trained by years of slavery to detect danger in the slightest change of tone, picked up words that made her blood chill. The Cholulans, it seemed, had received messages from Tenochtitlan messages that painted the Spanish not as honored guests, but as threats to be eliminated. The trap, when it revealed itself, bore all the hallmarks of Mexica cunning. Streets that had welcomed the Spanish began to empty of civilians as dawn approached. Market stalls stood abandoned, their goods left scattered as if their owners had fled in haste. The usual sounds of urban life, children playing, women grinding maize, men discussing the day's work, faded into an unnatural silence that made even the horses nervous. Spanish veterans, men who had survived ambushes in Italy and castle sieges in Castile, felt their scars itch with the familiar warning of approaching violence. They checked their sword hilts, tested bowstring tension, and whispered prayers to saints whose names would have meant nothing to the jade gods watching from temple heights. The Tlaxcalan warriors, reading the same signs through different cultural lenses, began to paint their faces with war colors and check their macuahuitl edges for any chips that might dull the obsidian teeth. When the attack came, it erupted with the sudden violence of a thunderstorm breaking over mountain peaks. But Cortés had learned the art of preemption during his years in the Caribbean, and Spanish doctrine favored striking first with overwhelming force. What the Cholulans had planned as an ambush became their own destruction. The temple courtyard, sacred ground where priests had burned incense for centuries, transformed into a slaughterhouse within minutes. Spanish steel cut through cotton armor as if it were paper, while Tlaxcalan allies settled old scores with neighbors who had grown fat on tribute trade with the Mexican Empire. The carved serpent heads that adorned temple walls seemed to weep stone tears as blood pooled in the geometric patterns of the courtyard floor. Nahua witnesses, those few who survived to tell the tale, remembered specific details that would haunt their dreams for decades. They spoke of trapped nobles, men of lineage and learning, who had expected ritual combat but found only butchery. They described temples burning, the sacred books and codices that contained centuries of accumulated wisdom, feeding flames that turned the sky orange with grief. They recalled streets running so thick with blood that sandaled feet slipped on stone that had never been designed to drain such quantities of human life. The massacre at Cholula lasted hours, but reshaped the political landscape of central Mexico in ways that would echo for generations. Word of the slaughter spread along trade routes faster than the Spanish army could march, carrying a message more powerful than any diplomatic embassy. These pale strangers, did not play by the rules that had governed Mesoamerican warfare for centuries. City-states that had wavered in their loyalty to Moctezuma now faced a stark choice. The Spanish had demonstrated they would not hesitate to destroy entire populations if they suspected treachery. But they had also shown they could protect allies like the Tlaxcalans, who now marched as equals in a coalition that grew stronger with each passing day. Tribute lists that had once seemed eternal suddenly appeared negotiable, and old grudges against Tenochtitlan began to outweigh fear of the unknown. Imagine standing in your own city's central plaza, watching smoke rise from temples that had stood since your grandfather's grandfather's time, knowing that the world your ancestors built was ending in blood and flames. As the Spanish Tlaxcalan army resumed its march toward Lake Texcoco, they left behind a Cholula that would never again hear the morning drums call pilgrims to prayer, but ahead lay Tenochtitlan, where Moctezuma waited with an empire's worth of warriors and the growing certainty that these strangers intended to finish what they had started. The scent of copal incense mixed with quetzal feathers and hammered gold filled the autumn air as Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, lord of the Mexica, prepared to meet the pale strangers who claimed dominion over distant lands beyond the eastern waters. November 1519 brought the cool season to the Valley of Mexico, when morning mist rose from Lake Texcoco like the breath of sleeping gods, and the mountain peaks surrounding the Great Basin caught the first light of dawn on their snow-covered summits. From his palace windows, Moctezuma could see the causeways that connected his island capital to the mainland, those engineering marvels that allowed 250,000 souls to live where nature had intended only fish and waterfowl to thrive. The western causeway to Tlacopan stretched several kilometers across the lake's shimmering surface, its stone foundations strong enough to support armies, but elegant enough to reflect the empire's sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering. But on this morning, those same causeways would deliver visitors whose presence would transform the greatest city in the Americas into a stage for cultural collision on an unprecedented scale. The Spanish Tlaxcalan army approached Tenochtitlan like a many-headed serpent, their ranks swollen by allies who had joined the march after witnessing the destruction of Cholula. Thousands of warriors from city-states that had chafed under Mexica tribute demands now carried Spanish banners alongside their traditional battle standards, their faces painted with war colors that mixed hope and vengeance in equal measure. The sound of their approach, iron horseshoes striking stone, Spanish armor clanking with each step, Nahuatl war songs rising from indigenous throats echoed across the water like thunder from a clear sky. For Moctezuma, this moment represented the culmination of months of impossible decisions. His spies had brought reports of Spanish military capabilities that defied every assumption about warfare. These strangers fought without regard for capturing prisoners, showed no interest in the ritual combat that had defined Mesoamerican conflict for centuries, and possessed weapons that could kill at distances that made traditional tactics obsolete. Yet they also demonstrated a hunger for gold that suggested they might be negotiated with, bought off, or perhaps even controlled through the careful application of imperial wealth. The first audience between emperor and conquistador unfolded with the elaborate ceremony that Mexica protocol demanded. Moctezuma appeared in the full regalia of divine kingship, a feathered headdress that caught sunlight like trapped fire, gold discs the size of dinner plates that reflected his movements in fractured brilliance, and cotton robes so fine they seemed woven from cloud and shadow. Copal smoke rose from jade braziers, carrying prayers to gods whose names the Spanish would never learn to pronounce correctly. Cortés, for his part, played the role of visiting dignitary with the calculated precision of a man who had studied imperial courts from Castile to Cuba. He offered gifts that seemed modest by Spanish standards but represented technological marvels to Nahua eyes: steel knives that held edges no obsidian could match, mirrors that reflected faces with impossible clarity, and glass beads that captured light in ways that challenged everything indigenous craftsmen understood about working with transparent materials. But beneath the diplomatic theatre, both men were conducting a more fundamental negotiation about the nature of power itself. Moctezuma wielded authority that flowed from divine appointment, supported by tribute systems that had enriched Tenochtitlan for generations and military traditions that had conquered most of central Mexico. Cortés commanded loyalty, bought with promise of wealth, and held together by European concepts of military discipline that treated soldiers as interchangeable parts in a larger machine designed for conquest. The Spanish were lodged in the palace of Tóxcatl, a complex of buildings that could house hundreds of visitors while keeping them comfortably isolated from the general population. The The rooms assigned to them featured stone walls decorated with geometric patterns that caught torchlight in hypnotic designs, floors covered with reed mats woven so tightly they felt soft as fabric underfoot, and windows that offered views of the city's canals, where thousands of canoes moved like water beetles carrying goods to markets that never closed. It was in these quarters that Spanish soldiers made a discovery that would reshape their understanding of Mexican wealth. Hidden behind a plastered wall, they found chambers filled with gold and precious regalia accumulated over generations of conquest and tribute collection. The sight of hammered gold discs stacked like tortillas, jade masks with obsidian eyes that seemed to watch the intruders, and feathered costumes worth more than Spanish estates, left even hardened veterans speechless with awe and greed. The creak of wooden chests being opened for the first time in years mixed with the gasps of Spanish soldiers who had never imagined such concentrated wealth existed anywhere in the world. Mexican nobles, summoned to witness this violation of sacred storage spaces, watched in stunned silence as strangers handled objects that represented not just monetary value, but the accumulated spiritual power of an empire built over centuries. Within days of his arrival, Cortés made the decision that would transform diplomatic visit into military occupation. Using a combination of Spanish steel held to noble throats and carefully calculated displays of violence, he took Moctezuma hostage in his own palace. The emperor, who had commanded millions, now found his movements restricted, his words filtered through Spanish interpreters, and his divine authority reduced to a performance staged for the benefit of occupiers who barely understood the cultural foundations they were systematically destroying. Nahua chroniclers would remember this moment with phrases that captured both the political and spiritual dimensions of the disaster. Our Lord no longer walked freely. The courtyards that had once echoed with the conversations of tribute collectors, the footsteps of provincial governors, and the chanting of priests conducting daily rituals fell silent, except for the foreign sounds of Spanish boots and the nervous coughing of guards who had never learned how to breathe easily in the thin air of high altitude. Yet life in Tenochtitlan continued with the strange resilience that characterizes urban populations under occupation. Tribute kitchens still steamed with tamales wrapped in corn husks and flavored with chilies that brought tears to Spanish eyes. Chinampa farmers poled their canoes through the network of canals that laced the city, their vessels loaded with amaranth, squash and maize that fed the 250,000 souls who called the lake basin home. The floating gardens that supplied much of the city's food represented agricultural techniques that European observers couldn't begin to understand, yet the Spanish ate the produce without questioning the engineering that made such abundance possible. From the Templo Mayor, the great pyramid that dominated the city's skyline at roughly 45 meters in height, drums still thudded at dawn as priests called the faithful to witness rituals that had marked time for centuries. The sound of the huehuetl mixed with the crack of Spanish guns in a sonic collision that seemed to summarize everything happening to this civilization. The twin shrines at the pyramid's summit, dedicated to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, continued to receive offerings of flowers, incense, and blood. But now they did so, under the watchful eyes of strangers who saw only idolatry, where Nahua souls recognized the fundamental architecture of cosmic order. Spanish soldiers, practical men who had learned to adapt their equipment to local conditions during campaigns across the Mediterranean and Caribbean, quickly discovered that cotton armor worked better than European mail in the valley's intense sunlight and humid air. The Ichkawipili, thickly quilted and waxed to turn arrows and obsidian blades, proved lighter and more comfortable than steel plate, while providing adequate protection against indigenous weapons. This practical adoption of local technology represented one of the few examples of cultural exchange flowing from conquered to conqueror during those early months of occupation. Think of yourself walking through market stalls where Spanish steel and Nahua obsidian lay side by side, where the scent of European horses mixed with copal incense, and where every conversation required translation between worldviews that had never been designed to coexist. But beneath the surface accommodation, tension accumulated like pressure behind a dam, building toward an explosion that would transform uneasy coexistence into total war and turn the most beautiful city in the Americas into a battlefield where no quarter would be asked or given. The ankle bells of Mexica dancers fell silent mid-song as Spanish steel swept through the Templo Mayor courtyard, turning a sacred festival into a slaughterhouse that would drench temple stones in blood ankle-deep within the span of a single hour. May 1520 brought the season of Tóxcatl to Tenochtitlan, when the city's greatest festival honored Tezcatlipoca with ceremonies that had marked time since the founding of the empire. For the Mexica, This was more than religious observance. It was the moment when heaven and earth touched, when dances became living prayers, and every step traced the cosmic patterns that held the world together. The irony would not be lost on later chroniclers that paradise ended during a celebration of the gods' enduring protection. Pedro de Alvarado had been left in command while Cortés marched east to confront Panfilo de Narváez, the Spanish captain sent from Cuba to arrest the conquistador for exceeding his authority. The mathematics of empire had grown complicated. Cortés needed to defeat a rival Spanish force of nearly 1,000 men while maintaining control over a city of 250,000 souls with fewer than 100 soldiers. His solution was to divide his attention between two enemies, a decision that would prove catastrophic for both Spanish and Mexica alike. The festival preparations had transformed Tenochtitlan into a city of living art. Feathered costumes that required months to complete emerged from noble houses, their quetzal plumes and hummingbird breasts arranged in patterns that captured sunlight like trapped rainbows. Flower garlands wound through the streets, their petals releasing perfumes that mixed with copal incense to create an atmosphere thick with sacred fragrance. Musicians tuned drums whose voices would carry prayers to heights where eagles soared, while dancers practiced steps that had been passed down through generations of priests who understood the cosmic significance of each movement. The performers who gathered in the Templo Mayor's courtyard represented the finest artistic achievement of Mesoamerican civilization. These were not amateur celebrants but trained specialists whose bodies had become instruments capable of translating spiritual concepts into physical movement. Their cotton cloaks bore embroidered symbols that told stories older than Spanish memory, while their faces carried paint in colors extracted from insects and minerals gathered from across the empire's vast territories. For hours, the ceremony unfolded with the precision that characterized all major Mexica rituals. Conch trumpets called from temple heights, their deep voices carrying across the lake basin to villages where people paused in their daily work to acknowledge the sacred time. Turtle-shell drums provided the heartbeat rhythm that synchronized hundreds of dancers, their sounds mixing with ankle bells, bone whistles, and the chanted prayers of priests whose voices had been trained to carry divine messages between worlds. Alvarado watched from the shadows with growing anxiety that had nothing to do with religious respect and everything to do with military paranoia. The Spanish captain, a man whose experience in Caribbean conquest had taught him to see conspiracy in every gathering of indigenous people, interpreted the festival through the lens of European fears about native uprisings. The sight of hundreds of Mexica nobles moving in coordinated patterns, their voices raised in chants he couldn't understand, struck him as preparation for organized rebellion rather than religious devotion. The attack, when it came, violated every concept of sacred space that had governed Mesoamerican civilization for centuries. Spanish guards, positioned at the courtyard's entrances on Alvarado's orders, suddenly blocked the exits, while their captain gave the signal for what would become known as the Tóxcatl Massacre. Steel swords cut through cotton robes as if they were morning mist, while Spanish daggers found the spaces between ribs with the efficiency that European warfare had perfected through centuries of battlefield innovation. Nahua witnesses, those few who survived the slaughter, remembered details that would haunt their testimonies for decades. They spoke of men's hands being chopped off as they raised arms to shield their faces from descending blades, of flower garlands soaking up blood until petals turned from white to crimson in moments. They described the sound of ankle bells continuing to chime even as their wearers fell, creating a metallic counterpoint to screams and the wet sounds of steel entering flesh. The dancers, trained for ceremony rather than combat, possessed no weapons beyond the ritual objects that were part of their costumes. Obsidian mirrors that had been polished to reflect divine light shattered under Spanish boots, while feathered headdresses that represented years of skilled labor were trampled into the growing pool of blood that transformed the sacred courtyard into a scene from the deepest levels of the underworld. Within an hour, the temple precinct had been transformed from the spiritual heart of an empire into a charnel house that reeked of death and violated sanctity. The geometric patterns carved into stone floors, designs that had been created to channel divine energy, now served as drainage for human blood. Copal braziers continued to burn, their sacred smoke rising through air thick with the copper scent of slaughter and the cries of the dying. The massacre's aftermath rippled through Tenochtitlan like earthquake tremors. Word of the slaughter spread along the city's canal network faster than canoes could carry messengers, transforming market conversations and household routines into councils of war. The Spanish had not merely killed Mexican nobles, they had desecrated the sacred center of the universe, violated the space where gods and mortals met, and demonstrated that no person or place in the empire could claim protection from foreign violence. By late May, Cortés had returned from the coast with victory over Narvaez and roughly 1,000 additional Spanish soldiers, but his triumph had become a strategic disaster. The reinforcements he had gained came at the cost of unified Mexica resistance, while the supplies they carried proved inadequate for an army now trapped in a city where every face showed hatred and every shadow might hide an assassin. Moctezuma, the once divine emperor reduced to Spanish puppet, was brought to a palace rooftop in early June as crowds gathered below demanding vengeance for the Tóxcatl Massacre. Whether the stones and darts that struck him came from his own people's rage or Spanish treachery remained a matter of bitter debate, but his death within days marked the end of any possibility for negotiated settlement. The man who had ruled an empire from divine right now lay silent, his authority transferred to his brother Cuauhtémoc, who had spent months watching foreign occupation and planning indigenous revenge. Picture yourself standing in that blood-soaked temple courtyard as the last dancer's ankle bells fall silent, knowing that the world you were born into has just ended forever, and the one being born in its place will be written in fire and steel. Cuauhtémoc's first acts as Tlatoani involved lifting the wooden bridges along the causeways and building barricades of stakes and rubble, transforming Tenochtitlan from an open city into a fortress whose 250,000 inhabitants would soon become 250,000 enemies surrounding the Spanish garrison that had brought this catastrophe upon themselves. Rain mixed with blood ran through the gaps between causeway stones as Spanish steel clattered against obsidian in the darkness, while Lake Texcoco swallowed men whose greed had weighted them with gold too heavy for swimming. The night of June 30th to July 1st, 1520, would be remembered in Spanish chronicles as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, but for the Mexica warriors who had spent weeks preparing their revenge, it represented something closer to divine justice finally delivered through human hands. Cuauhtémoc, the new Tlatoani who had assumed power after his brother Moctezuma's death, had transformed Tenochtitlan from an occupied city into a carefully constructed trap. Every causeway bridge had been lifted, every canal crossing blocked, every rooftop turned into a firing position for slingers whose smooth lake stones could crack Spanish skulls with the same efficiency their ancestors had used against enemy armies for generations. The Spanish garrison had been trapped in the palace complex for weeks, watching their food supplies dwindle while outside their windows the city that had once tolerated their presence organized for total war. The sound of drums echoed from the Templo Mayor at all hours, not the ceremonial rhythms that had marked religious festivals, but the urgent battle beats that called warriors to weapons and summoned the gods to witness the destruction of invaders who had violated every sacred law that governed civilized behavior. Cortés faced the mathematician's nightmare that had haunted every conquistador since the Caribbean campaigns began. Too few soldiers, too much territory, and enemies who outnumbered his force by ratios that made conventional military doctrine irrelevant. His reinforcements from the Narvaez expedition had brought Spanish numbers to roughly 1,000 men, but those same reinforcements had also brought Spanish appetites that consumed supplies faster than foraging parties could replenish them. The palace storerooms that had once seemed inexhaustible now echoed with emptiness, while outside the city's 250,000 inhabitants prepared for a siege that would end only with foreign blood feeding the lake basin's hungry earth. The escape plan, when Cortés finally accepted that retreat offered the only path to survival, required the kind of precise timing that European armies had perfected through centuries of withdrawal under pressure. The Spanish would move at night, carrying portable bridges to span the gaps where Mexica engineers had removed causeway connections. They would travel light, abandoning most of their accumulated treasure, and trust to darkness, speed, and the shock of sudden movement to carry them through indigenous positions before organized resistance could form. But greed, that fundamental force that had driven Spanish expansion across 2 oceans, proved stronger than military discipline when survival demanded sacrifice. Soldiers who had spent months staring at rooms full of hammered gold, jade masks worth more than European estates, and feathered costumes that represented generations of skilled craftsmanship, found themselves unable to abandon wealth that might never be seen again. They stuffed gold discs into their clothing, wrapped jewelry in their bedrolls, and loaded themselves with Mexica treasure until some men could barely walk, much less run or swim when the situation demanded both. The procession that crept through Tenochtitlan's streets in the pre-dawn darkness moved with the muffled sounds of an army trying to become invisible. Spanish boots were wrapped in cloth to muffle their sound against stone pavement, while horse hooves had been bound with leather strips that absorbed the metallic ring of iron on volcanic rock. Tlaxcalan allies, their loyalty tested by months of urban warfare, carried their own wounded and tried to ignore the growing certainty that they were fleeing toward battles that would make their mountain homeland a target for Mexica vengeance. The western causeway to Tlaxcalan stretched several kilometers across Lake Texcoco's dark water, its stone foundation just wide enough for men to march four abreast, but narrow enough that any serious resistance could trap an entire army between water too deep for wading and enemies too numerous for fighting. Portable bridges, hastily constructed from palace timbers, represented the expedition's only chance of crossing the gaps where Cuitlahuac's engineers had broken the causeway connections. For the first few hundred meters, the retreat proceeded with the eerie quiet that marks armies moving through hostile territory. Spanish steel whispered against leather scabbards, while Tlaxcalan cotton armor rustled like wind through dry cornstalks. The sound of Lake Texcoco lapping against causeway stones provided a constant background murmur, punctuated occasionally by the distant cry of water birds disturbed from their roosts by unfamiliar human activity. But Mexica sentries had been watching for exactly this moment, and the city's canal network allowed rapid communication between observation points scattered across the lake basin. Conch shell trumpets began to sound from Temple Heights as dawn approached, their deep voices carrying across the water like the breath of awakening gods. War drums followed, their rhythms building from single beats to thunderous cascades that seemed to make the causeway stones vibrate beneath Spanish feet. The attack, when it erupted around the retreating column, came from directions that European military experience had never prepared soldiers to defend. Hundreds of canoes emerged from the pre-dawn darkness, like water jaguars circling wounded prey, their hulls black against the lake's surface, and their crews armed with obsidian-bladed weapons that flashed by torchlight. Mexica warriors had painted their faces with soot and war colors, transforming themselves into supernatural figures that seemed to rise from the underworld to collect debts written in blood and violation. Atlatl darts feathered with eagle down whistled through the darkness, their obsidian points seeking gaps between Spanish armor plates or the exposed throats of horses whose screams added to the chaos building around the trapped column. Slingers on rooftops of buildings that lined parts of the causeway sent smooth stones arcing through the night air, their projectiles striking Spanish helmets with sounds like breaking pottery mixed with the wet crack of fractured skulls. The portable bridges, those carefully constructed pieces of engineering that represented the expedition's only hope of crossing causeway gaps, became bottlenecks where Spanish discipline collapsed under indigenous pressure. Men weighted down with gold found themselves unable to move quickly enough to maintain formation, while others discovered that swimming in lake water while wearing stolen treasure was a mathematical impossibility that physics resolved with brutal finality. Macuahuitl blades, those wooden swords embedded with volcanic glass teeth, found their perfect targets in the cramped conditions of causeway fighting. Spanish steel, designed for the open battlefields of Europe, proved less effective in confined spaces where obsidian could strike from unexpected angles, and Mexica warriors could use their superior knowledge of local terrain to attack from positions that Spanish training had never anticipated. The sounds of that night screams mixing with splash of bodies hitting water, the crack of obsidian blades against steel helmets, the urgent shouts of Spanish officers trying to maintain unit cohesion in conditions where military organization had become impossible, would haunt survivor testimony for decades. Rain began falling as the battle intensified, turning causeway stones slippery and mixing Spanish blood with lake water in combinations that seemed to satisfy some cosmic requirement for balance. In modern Mexico City, construction workers occasionally uncover artifacts from that night: a golden ingot weighing roughly 2 kilograms, its edges worn smooth by centuries of mud and human passage, represents wealth that Spanish greed made too heavy to carry when survival required speed more than treasure. Consider yourself trapped on that narrow causeway as dawn approaches, watching your companions disappear into dark water while obsidian blades flash around you like deadly stars, and knowing that the gold in your pack might buy your death but cannot purchase your salvation. Those Spanish soldiers who survived the causeway fighting would reach the mainland carrying wounds that went deeper than steel, but behind them, Tenochtitlan burned with the light of victory fires, and ahead lay months of warfare that would determine whether Cortés had led an army to conquest or merely to a more elaborate form of destruction. The sweet-sour stench of rotting flesh rose from every canal and courtyard in Tenochtitlan, as smallpox pustules burst like poisoned flowers across the skin of an empire that had never learned to fear invisible death. 1520 had brought more than Spanish steel and horses to the New World, It had carried microscopic weapons that would prove more devastating than all the cannon and crossbows in Cortés's arsenal combined. The disease arrived with Pánfilo de Narvaez's expedition, traveling in the breath and blood of men who had developed immunity through childhood exposure to epidemics that periodically swept through European cities. For the indigenous populations of Mexico, who had lived in biological isolation for thousands of years, this microscopic invasion represented an enemy more alien and deadly than anything their military traditions had prepared them to fight. The Mexica called it Huizahuatl, the Great Rash, but no name could capture the horror of watching skin erupt in pustules that looked like grains of maize planted in human flesh. The fever that accompanied the disease burned through victims with an intensity that made them delirious, their bodies radiating heat that could be felt from arm's length, while they shivered with chills that no amount of cotton blankets could warm. The smell that rose from infected mats became so overwhelming that even the constant burning of copal incense could not mask the stench of cellular death occurring on a civilizational scale. Cuauhtémoc, the Tlatoani who had assumed power after his brother Moctezuma's death, had spent his brief reign organizing indigenous resistance with the strategic brilliance that characterized the best Mexica military leadership. He had turned every causeway into a fortress, transformed every rooftop into a firing position, and unified the scattered city-states of central Mexico into a coalition determined to drive the Spanish back into the eastern sea from which they had emerged. His speeches to gathered warriors promised that they would break the reeds of the invaders, using a metaphor that captured both the fragility of Spanish power and the Mexica determination to snap it through coordinated pressure. But no amount of military genius could organize a defense against an enemy that attacked through the very air that people breathed. The smallpox epidemic that swept through Tenochtitlan in the months following the Night of Sorrows killed with the impartiality that characterized all great natural disasters. Noble and commoner, warrior and priest, young and old, the disease made no distinctions based on social rank, military experience, or spiritual preparation. It simply killed, methodically and efficiently, reducing the population that had survived Spanish steel to a fraction of its former strength. The epidemic's progression through the city followed the patterns of urban life that had made Tenochtitlan great. Canoe traffic along the canal network carried infection from neighborhood to neighborhood with the same efficiency it had once carried tribute and trade goods. The great market at Tlatelolco, which had hosted 20,000 to 60,000 people daily during peacetime, became a transmission center where a single infected merchant could expose hundreds of potential victims in the course of an ordinary morning's business. Medical knowledge that had served the Mexica for centuries proved useless against a disease that operated according to biological principles no indigenous healer had ever encountered. Priests who had successfully treated battlefield wounds, set broken bones, and delivered babies found themselves helpless as patients died despite receiving every treatment that traditional medicine could provide. Steam baths, herbal remedies, bloodletting, and prayer, all the therapeutic techniques that had been refined over generations of medical practice, failed to stop an epidemic that killed roughly half of everyone it infected. The sound of funeral pyres burning day and night became the background noise of a dying city. Wood that had once been saved for ceremonial fires now served the desperate necessity of disposing of corpses before they could spread even more disease. The smoke that rose from these cremations mixed the scent of burning cedar and pine with the more troubling odors of human flesh, creating an atmospheric combination that survivors would associate with the end of the world they had known. Cuauhtémoc himself fell victim to the epidemic after approximately 80 days in power, his death representing both personal tragedy and political disaster for Mexica resistance. The Tlatoani, who had organized the most effective indigenous military response to Spanish invasion, died coughing blood while his eyes crusted over with infection, his body's immune system overwhelmed by a disease that European children survived as a routine childhood illness. The succession that followed brought Cuauhtémoc to power in early 1521, a young man whose name meant falling eagle, and whose reign would be defined by the impossible task of defending a civilization against enemies that attacked from both visible and invisible directions. Moctezuma's nephew possessed the military skills and political intelligence needed for wartime leadership, but he also inherited an empire that had been reduced by disease to a fraction of its former strength and resources. Cuauhtémoc's speeches to the surviving population mixed military strategy with spiritual defiance, promising to continue the resistance that his predecessors had begun. He rallied the warriors of Tlatelolco and Tenochtitlan, with words that acknowledged the magnitude of the disaster, while insisting that Mexican courage could overcome any enemy, whether they came armed with steel or carried invisible weapons in their breath. The new Tlatoani understood that Spanish victory was no longer a matter of military superiority. It had become a race between indigenous adaptation and biological collapse. Meanwhile, in the mountains of Tlaxcalan, Spanish survivors of the Night of Sorrows had spent months recovering from wounds that went deeper than steel, while planning a return to the lake basin that would settle accounts written in blood and gold. Cortés, his expedition reduced to a fraction of its original strength, but reinforced by new allies who had witnessed Mexica's weakness during the epidemic, had conceived a strategy that combined European naval technology with indigenous labor to create weapons that could dominate Lake Texcoco. The brigantines' 13 shallow draft vessels, designed specifically for lake warfare, represented an engineering achievement that required the collaboration of Spanish shipwrights and Nahua carpenters working with tools and techniques from two different worlds. Pine and cypress trees were felled in the Tlaxcalan mountains and hauled roughly 100 kilometers to Texcoco, where hulls were assembled using European joinery methods but indigenous knowledge of local wood properties. The ships were then slid into the lake using sleds and rollers, their swivel guns capable of blasting stone causeway barricades at ranges under 100 meters. Spanish artillery, which had proven less effective than hoped during urban fighting in Tenochtitlan's narrow streets, would find ideal targets in the open water of Lake Texcoco. The brigantines could ram indigenous canoes, blast defensive positions along the shoreline, and provide mobile firing platforms that could support infantry advances along the causeways while remaining immune to most Mexica weapons. But Cuauhtémoc had also learned from the previous year's fighting, and Mexica engineers had spent the winter months preparing countermeasures that would challenge Spanish naval superiority. Stakes were sunk in shallow channels to hole enemy hulls, floating log traps were positioned to tangle rigging, and divers were trained to cut anchor ropes during night raids that would leave Spanish vessels drifting helplessly toward shore positions where obsidian blades waited to settle accounts. Think of yourself standing on the temple steps of Tenochtitlan as smoke from funeral pyres mixes with the scent of copal incense, watching the lake where enemy ships will soon appear, while knowing that half your neighbors have already died of a disease you cannot see, fight, or understand. By May 1521, as the dry season reached its peak and the lake level dropped to expose more of the mudflats and reed beds that surrounded the island city, Spanish brigantines were patrolling the waters around Tenochtitlan like mechanical predators, their bronze cannon glinting in sunlight that would soon witness the final siege of the greatest city the Americas had ever known. The metats rang hollow as Mexica women ground air instead of maize, their stone-grinding tools scraping against emptiness, while the sound of Spanish cannon fire echoed across a lake that had become a graveyard for floating bodies and broken dreams. May through August 1521 marked the final act of a civilizational tragedy that had been building since those first Spanish sails appeared on the eastern horizon. The siege of Tenochtitlan represented more than military strategy. It was a methodical strangulation of the greatest city in the Americas, conducted with European precision and indigenous collaboration on a scale that dwarfed every previous conflict in Mesoamerican history. Cuauhtémoc, the young Tlatoani, whose name meant falling eagle, faced the impossible mathematics of defending 250,000 civilians against enemies who controlled both the lake and the sky. The Spanish brigantines patrolled Lake Texcoco like mechanical sharks, their bronze swivel guns raking stone barricades while ramming the hundreds of canoes that had once carried tribute and trade goods to markets that would never reopen. Each vessel represented a fusion of European naval technology with indigenous labor, their hulls crafted by Nahua carpenters who had felled trees in distant mountains and hauled timber across terrain that Spanish horses could barely navigate. The irony was lost on no one. Mexica hands had built the weapons that would destroy their own city. But Cuauhtémoc had not spent the winter months in idleness. Mexica engineers had transformed Lake Texcoco into a maze of underwater obstacles designed to challenge Spanish naval superiority. Stakes were driven into shallow channels with the precision that characterized all indigenous engineering, their sharpened points positioned to hole enemy hulls while remaining invisible beneath the lake's dark surface. Floating log traps, constructed from trees that had once provided shade for temple ceremonies, were anchored in shipping channels where they could tangle rigging and leave Spanish vessels helpless targets for indigenous fire arrows. The most audacious Mexica countermeasures involved divers who had trained since childhood to hold their breath for impossible lengths of time. These underwater warriors swam beneath brigantines during night raids, carrying stone awls capable of boring holes in wooden hulls with patient, methodical pressure. Spanish crews reported returning to shore with their vessels listing ominously, bilges gurgling like wounded animals as lake water seeped through damage that seemed to appear spontaneously. The siege tightened with the methodical progression that characterized European military doctrine applied to urban warfare. Cortés had learned from his previous failure in Tenochtitlan that the city's narrow streets and canal network negated most Spanish advantages, so his strategy focused on demolishing house rows to create broader avenues suitable for cavalry charges. Each day brought the sound of crashing masonry as Spanish allied forces reduced neighborhoods to rubble, advancing block by block while constant dust clouds choked defenders and attackers alike. Food became the most effective weapon in the Spanish arsenal. The great market at Tlatelolco, which had once hosted 20,000 to 60,000 people daily, fell silent as Spanish forces cut the trade routes that had fed the lake basin for centuries. Sellers who had once offered exotic goods from across Mesoamerica, tropical fruits, highland textiles, lowland cacao, highland obsidian vanished from stalls that now served as defensive positions for slingers whose smooth stones could crack Spanish skulls at 50 paces. By July 1521, famine had swollen the bellies of children, whose games now involved hunting axolotls in muddy ditches rather than the elaborate ball courts that had once provided entertainment for noble families. People boiled leather stripped from shields and sandals, their desperation so complete that they scraped lime plaster from temple walls and consumed it despite the chemical burns that blistered mouths and throats. The calcium provided minimal nutrition, but it also provided the illusion of eating something substantial in a city where substance had become memory. Nahua annalists, those scribes whose duty involved recording events for posterity, wrote entries that captured the horror with mathematical precision. Parents trading children for a few tortillas, transactions that would have been unthinkable during the empire's prosperous decades, but had become routine in a city where survival trumped every other consideration. These were not isolated incidents, but systematic indicators of civilizational collapse, recorded by men who understood they were documenting the end of their world. Spanish forces had cut the aqueduct from Chapultepec, that engineering marvel that had provided fresh water to the island city for generations. The thirst that followed etched tongues and cracked lips, forcing people to drink brackish lake water that caused cramps and fevers within hours of consumption. The taste of salt and algae became associated with approaching death, while the sound of people retching from waterborne illness provided another layer of misery to a soundscape already dominated by cannon fire and human suffering. Cuauhtémoc refused to surrender despite conditions that would have broken the will of less determined leaders. The young Tlatoani organized night sorties in canoes numbering in the hundreds, their crews paddling in perfect unison while their faces were blackened with soot to blend with the darkness. These raids targeted Spanish positions along the shoreline with the coordination that had made Mexica military forces legendary throughout central Mexico, but they also served a psychological purpose, demonstrating that indigenous resistance continued despite overwhelming odds. The war cries that echoed across Lake Texcoco during these nighttime attacks mixed Nahuatl battle songs with the deeper sounds of conch shell trumpets and turtle shell drums, creating an audio landscape that reminded defenders of the cultural traditions they were dying to preserve. Atlatl darts, feathered with eagle down, whistled through darkness towards Spanish positions, their obsidian points seeking gaps between armor plates with the precision that indigenous warriors had perfected through centuries of ritual combat. Spanish prisoners captured during these raids faced fates that demonstrated the religious dimensions underlying what Europeans understood as purely military conflict. Witnesses reported seeing captives paraded up pyramid steps to the sound of drums that could be heard across the lake basin, their hearts lifted steaming to the 4 cardinal directions in ceremonies that fed gods who demanded payment for the violation of sacred spaces. Spanish survivors could hear the drums and see the smoke rising from temple heights, knowing that their comrades were providing spiritual currency in transactions between worlds. The macuahuitl, that wooden sword embedded with volcanic glass teeth, found its perfect battlefield in the narrow streets and canal-side fighting that characterized the siege's final phase. Spanish steel, designed for open European battlefields, proved less effective in confined urban spaces where obsidian could strike from unexpected angles and Mexica warriors could exploit their superior knowledge of local geography. The sound of obsidian blades against steel helmets became as common as the splash of bodies hitting canal water, creating a metallic percussion that mixed with screams and the constant background noise of structural collapse. Spanish mastiffs, those European war dogs with iron collars and training that taught them to tear human flesh, earned curses in Nahuatl that would survive in oral tradition for centuries. Indigenous sources called them night-snouted beasts, whose attacks violated every concept of honorable combat that had governed Mesoamerican warfare since the classical period. The sight of dogs dragging warriors to the ground while Spanish soldiers finished them with steel blades represented a level of barbarity that shocked people whose own military traditions included ritual cannibalism and mass human sacrifice. The final stand in Tlatelolco, during early August 1521, transformed the northern district of Tenochtitlan into a fortress built from barricades of beams and bodies. Water in the surrounding canals ran scarlet from wounds that would not stop bleeding, while drums pounded from temple heights until the last priest fell, with obsidian knife still clutched in hands that had offered thousands of hearts to gods who seemed unable to protect their own worshippers. On August 13th, 1521, Cuauhtémoc attempted escape by canoe in a desperate flight that ended when Garcia Holguin's brigantine overtook the imperial vessel near the reeds that marked the lake's edge. The young Tlatoani, whose defense had lasted approximately 80 days under siege while withstanding artillery bombardment, epidemic disease, and famine simultaneously, reportedly told his captors to take the dagger and kill me, rather than subject him to the humiliation of survival under foreign rule. After the city's fall, bodies lay unburied for days while vultures circled overhead in numbers that blocked sunlight. The sweet, sour stench of decay forced survivors to burn copal incense constantly, but no amount of sacred smoke could mask the smell of cellular death occurring on a civilizational scale. Lake Texcoco, which had reflected temple lights for centuries, now carried floating corpses toward shorelines where Spanish soldiers picked through the wreckage for gold that had become worthless to its former owners. The environmental transformation that followed Spanish victory reshaped not just the political landscape, but the physical geography of the lake basin. Colonial drainage projects that began in the 16th and 17th centuries reduced Lake Texcoco to a fraction of its former size, leaving dust storms where water had once glittered for a day's canoeing. Nahua survivors lamented fish scarcity and the loss of aquatic transportation networks that had defined urban life for generations. Yet cultural resilience survived even total military defeat. Dances continued with Christian saints' names replacing indigenous deities, their steps still counting the 13-day cycles that had structured Mesoamerican time since the classical period. Drumbeats were muted with cloth at night to avoid Spanish fines, but the rhythms that had carried prayers to heaven for centuries continued in hidden courtyards where memory work preserved the names of fallen captains, so they would not be swallowed by forgetfulness. Architecture became palimpsest as stones from the Templo Mayor were reused for the cathedral that would rise above the sacred precinct where Mexica priests had burned copal at dawn for generations. Spanish bells would toll where shell trumpets had once sounded, but Nahua ears could still detect the spiritual frequencies that connected earth to sky, despite the change in instruments and intentions. Picture yourself walking through the ruins of Tenochtitlan in the months following the conquest, breathing air thick with the stench of unburied dead, while Spanish soldiers strip gold from temple walls and Nahua survivors hide turquoise ear spools in roof beams. Two faiths, two worlds, carried on bodies that had learned to navigate between survival and memory, in a landscape where pyramids had become quarries and gods had been renamed but not forgotten. The final reckoning from the Nahua perspective revealed the true scale of the catastrophe, not simply 500 Spanish soldiers conquering an empire, but an anti-Mexica coalition of more than 100,000 indigenous allies, epidemic mortality that killed 30 to 50% of the population in some communities, and a lake city that had been starved into silence over 93 days that marked the end of one world and the bloody birth of another.